very warm welcome to the 10th talk in the Medical Humanities Colloquy. We have been running this seminar series for the last couple of semesters. And let me first thank Swati Joshi, who's one of our doctoral students. She has been co-organizing this series for the last couple of semesters. She has to finish work on her dissertation. So it will be Angel, one of our master students, who's rejoining the Institute very soon as Sabarmati Fellow, and she will be co-organizing this, helping me organize this from now on. And with that being said, a very warm welcome to everyone who's joining in from different parts of the world, maybe. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, hopefully not good night. This is Arko Chattopadhyay. I'm a faculty in the Humanities and Social Sciences Department in IIT Gandhinagar. And just to tell you very briefly about the seminar series, this colloquy initiated by the Humanities and Social Sciences IIT Gandhinagar is meant to open up dialogues between medicine, humanities, and literary and cultural studies by dwelling on their intersections that operate in the cultural field of medicine or medical culture, shall we say. And the series encourages discussions on trauma, suffering, loss, grief, recovery, coping mechanisms, transformed identities, and so on. And the presentations have covered various subdisciplines within the rubric of medical humanities like medical theater, clinical anthropology, psychoanalysis, medical literature. The talks conducted by the respective field experts and leaders will encounter and accentuate the granular details around themes like clinical communication, clinical care spaces, familial care, written and oral narratives of the patients, etc., that seldom get highlighted in the data-oriented clinical case studies. So it's a great thing that we have Professor Erik Larsen here today from University of Rochester, US. Welcome, Erik, and thank you for agreeing to do this talk. Let me now request Angel to formally introduce Erik, and we'll then go into the talk. So for the audience members, we'll have a Q&A at the end, and let's. I will, of course, enable all the unmuting options after the talk. You could drop in your question in the chat box, or you could unmute yourselves and speak. But before that, Angel, if you could please introduce Erik. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Hello, everyone. To introduce the speaker for today, Erik Larsen is Assistant Professor of Medical Humanities at the University of Rochester in USA. His scholarship and teaching focus on narrative medicine, biopolitics, and representation of health and disease in modern culture. He is co-editor with James Martell of Tattooed Bodies, Theorizing Body Inscription Across Disciplines and Cultures, which is published by Palgrave in 2022. And his essays have been published in 19th-century literature and Levinas Studies. A forthcoming chapter on zombies in biopolitics will appear in the Routledge Handbook of Health and Media. It's a pleasure to have you, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here with everyone. Okay, so the title of my talk today, this morning, I suppose it's evening for you all, and thank you so much for being here at the end of your day. The title of my talk is The Biopolitical Zombie, Medicalized Selfhood in 21st Century Political Fantasy. Full screen here. There we go. So zombies hold a peculiar but prominent place in the contemporary pantheon of cinematic and televisual monsters. These decrepit creatures lurch endlessly onto our screens, usurping vampires, ghosts, and extraterrestrial invaders as the leading agents of dread. One of the most popular cable television shows in history, AMC's The Walking Dead, evinces our continuing, if not strengthening, obsession with the monster. An immense number of zombie films and shows have been produced since 2001, a period often termed the zombie renaissance. Many examples feature elaborate special effects and major Hollywood stars, including Brad Pitt, Woody Harrelson, and Glenn Close, amongst many others. Hardly uniform in setting and genre, global zombie culture explores the monster in highly varied ways. Most zombies appear stripped of personhood, speech, and thought, but some, for example, the zombie protagonist of the romantic comedy warm bodies, express complex inner lives. Although many display signs of decay, the genre now includes dexterous monsters, more indicative of predatory vitality and creeping death, such as those stampeding through World War Z and Train to Busan. While I neither dismiss this variety nor its rich interpretive implications, a common feature informs most recent zombie media. Put simply, in the age of mass zombie culture, the zombies are conspicuously unhealthy. For the last 2 decades, the genre has fixated on bodily disorder and pandemic disease, rendering the zombie explicable through biological and biomedical epistemologies. Increasingly, the figure expresses our fears of endemic health crises, of genetic susceptibility, chronic disabling conditions, and infectious outbreaks in a globalized world. Some scholars argue that zombies stand in for our growing fears of senescent populations and neurological diseases, of disorders propagated as much from within as from without. Modern televisual and cinematic zombies reflect both perceived challenges to health and the conceptual changes underpinning our obsession with health in the 21st century. More specifically, this changing monster illustrates our increasingly biological understanding of self and the degree to which we conceptualize our personal and social lives in terms of contemporary biomedicine. But focusing solely on their connections to health fails to elucidate why our media consistently represent zombies as lacking personhood. Whatever its specific medical connotation, the zombie's unhealthiness seems integrally linked with the absence of characteristics we associate with the legal and social person. In most examples, the monster exhibits little or no evidence of thought, reason, and social awareness. In many contemporary films and television series, this condition is highly contagious, resulting in apocalyptic violence. Expressing more than our individual fears of personal poor health, the zombie's spreading bodily disorder threatens us with the total and permanent collapse of political and social order. Equating political dysfunction with the diseased other, the genre reveals a troubling confluence of our social nightmares and medical concepts. In what follows, I analyze a few prominent cinematic and televisual examples to elucidate a common assumption underpinning representations of the monster in 21st century media, namely the equation of self and personhood with the healthy body. Investigating how this connection structures our fantasies of social collapse and political restoration, I consider specifically the role of contemporary biomedicine's emphasis on the molecular constituents of health as a paradigm reshaping our political fears. To begin, I briefly analyze the genre's cinematic self-reinvention around themes of health in the film inaugurating the zombie renaissance, Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later. Turning to television, I investigate how the Walking Dead series equates social order with health through its epic narrative of pandemic disease and political collapse. George Romero's 1968 Night of the Living Dead reinvented the zombie for American movie audiences, transforming the monster into the apocalyptic flesh eater we expect today. In Night and its 2 sequels, Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, the zombies are conspicuously fleshy beings. Their decayed bodies and rapacious cannibalism are the traits of gratuitously physical creatures. The Dead trilogy began visually to link the zombie with our gross anatomy, opening the genre to its contemporary focus on biomedical selfhood. And yet, Romero's monsters function primarily as critical allegories, as reflections of American racism, consumerism, and militarism. They are physically grotesque in order to reveal Americans' grotesque behavior, and not to threaten us with disorders originating in our bodily tissue. In sharp contrast, most films of the zombie renaissance identify the monster as a thoroughly biomedical threat. One readily detects this shift in the opening scene of Danny Boyle's 28 Days Later, in which animal rights activists break into a Cambridge primate research facility in order to free chimpanzees. A researcher attempts to stop them, explaining that the animals are infected with the highly contagious rage virus. He justifies his experimentation by invoking its biomedical value. Quote, "In order to cure, you must first understand," close quote. Despite his warning that the ape's blood and saliva carry the infection, the activists release a single chimp, which brutally bites and infects one of them, transforming her rapidly into a vicious zombie. Unlike Romero's lumbering and decaying creatures, These zombies seem possessed by frenetic energy and swiftness, attacking not to devour, but to infect. After the opening scene fades to black, an intertitle appears, informing the viewer that 28 days have passed, the 28 days in which the virus has spread, destroying all signs of social order in the UK. While Romero's Dead trilogy seemed uninterested in the material source for the zombie apocalypse, 28 Days foregrounds a physical cause, rendering the threat intelligible through biomedical concepts. Prior to observing transmission and infection, the audience learns of its viral etiology from a scientific authority, and one whose warnings prove correct. The virus spreads through contact with common bodily fluids we associate with viral contamination. Minimal exposure to the eyes or mouth transmits the virus rapidly. In one scene, a single drop of blood falls into a character's open eye, infecting him in a matter of seconds. A common trope of the zombie renaissance, infection scenes like this one emphasize a relationship of physical pathogenic cause and symptomatic effect. Subsequent films strengthened the zombie's identification with communicable disease and biomedical concepts. Whether the result of nefarious scientific experimentation or natural pathogens, films such as Maggie, Zombieland, The Girl with All the Gifts, Cargo, and Train to Busan render zombies as problems with biological origins, explanations, and effects. One popular example, World War Z, visualizes our fears of a rapidly spreading emergent virus. More so than 28 Days, its zombies are athletically swift and predatory, infecting a host almost instantly. In World War Z, we watch as crowds transform swiftly into cascading walls of stampeding zombies. Although visually overwhelming, by situating the action within the unfolding apocalypse, the film offers hope for a biomedical cure. World War Z never doubts the efficacy of this medical approach, for it never questions the zombies' biological origins. Early in the film, a United Nations epidemiologist identifies the plague as an emerging virus, recommending a search for patient zero. Relying on a loose understanding of evolutionary biology, and with the help of a WHO lab, Jerry Lane, who's played by Brad Pitt, eventually discovers a prophylactic treatment. We can take the PowerPoint down now, and I'll just tell you when we can bring it back up. And yet interpreting recent depictions of zombies merely as responses to infectious disease fails to convey how thoroughly biomedical concepts redefine the genre. By imagining a virus originating in chimpanzees and transmitted through blood, 28 Days invoked fears of the HIV pandemic and emerging zoonotic diseases. But it also exposed anxieties about selfhood as we see it refracted through the lens of 21st century biomedicine. The film makes tangible both the transferability of animal viruses to humans and the biological parity between species. Regarded in this light, its thematic interest in rage takes on a complex biological meaning. 28 Days suggests that we are, like chimps, genetically prone to antisocial behavior. Rage is literally in our blood, for we inherit our tragic flaw from intrinsic genetic structures. Thus, the chimp's bite, what brings about the apocalyptic downfall of civilization, signifies both viral transference and the long evolutionary history of transferred genes. This tragic biologism may seem more the stuff of 19th century naturalism than modern horror, but the film reflects popular acceptance of a new biomedical understanding of self. Released in 2002, 1 year before completion of the Human Genome Project, 28 Days appeared in the midst of growing international interest in the molecular constituents of human life and disease. Nicholas Rose describes this molecularization in terms of a biomedical shift from large organ systems to the minutest elements of life, namely the genetic sequences, enzymes, proteins, and other basic materials of life. Developing since the 1960s, this paradigm shift has led, according to Rose, to a new medical ethos and culture of health. Beyond restoring function to ailing bodies and minds, the new medicine aims to transform the limits of life itself. Genomic research promises both to detect the conditions of many nightmarish diseases and to prevent them long before they are expressed, altering once fixed bodily limits. According to Rose, within this paradigm, quote, Mind is simply what the brain does, and mental pathology is simply the behavioral consequence of an identifiable and potentially correctable error or anomaly in some of those elements now identified as aspects of that organic brain, close quote. Hardly the province of specialists, this increasingly biomolecular and biomedical understanding of human life informs how we conceptualize the self, its relationships, its problems, and their solutions. Rose's description of a new medical ethos, one in which commercialized research and treatment offers to transform us from the molecular level up, might seem a far cry from the dystopic world of zombie media. Yet by redefining our sense of self, this paradigm has also transformed our fears. The more medical research investigates our molecular structures, the more it reveals our susceptibility to diseases that might and likely will alter body and mind profoundly. Although greater public understanding of molecular disease processes may inspire hope, this knowledge also creates the impression that we are all, quote, asymptomatically or pre-symptomatically ill, close quote. That's Rose. Due in part to modern biomedicine's success in prolonging life, we wonder when it will be our turn with cancer or Alzheimer's or other degenerative diseases. Fear of susceptibility to disease is far from new, but this paradigm revisions and deepens this anxiety. We are, it seems, confronted constantly with mutation, infection, and degeneration. But these problems and the biomedical knowledge developed to solve them confront us with something more terrifying. These processes threaten to deform the entire cell, leaving behind a damaged and dangerous fragment of human life. This fear that everything human hinges on our protein molecular biology inspires the distinctive terror of the zombie renaissance. Thus, 28 Days reimagines the zombie as a body stripped of self by contagious disease, but the film frames disease in terms of the mutating and flawed genetic structures we share with other life forms. This and many subsequent examples imply that one becomes a zombie when a biological source alters the body's cellular machinery, damaging the organic brain. If the paradigm described by Rose promises to improve us by unlocking our molecular structures, these films represent our terrified response to the dark possibilities of being remade from our tissues up. Horror, it seems, no longer requires the supernatural, just a willingness to imagine the darkest aspects of the biomolecular cell. This existential threat to the individual reveals the dual but linked roles played by the monster in 21st century imaginations. Zombies realize our fears of bodily dysfunction, but for just this reason, they also threaten us with political collapse. This trend should little surprise us. Having linked the healthy self with proper functioning of biomolecular structures, we have begun to imagine deleterious physical changes as loss of self, the rational and ethical self upon which political order seems to rest. Of course, nothing about the cultural linking of modern politics and health is new. From Michel Foucault, biopolitics emerged at the end of the 18th century when the European states began, in concert with the developing science of modern biology, to regard their subjects as fundamentally living beings. Around this time in Europe, traditional forms of political action, protecting, improving, and organizing the body politic, were reconceived in terms of the management of physical conditions understood through the nascent discipline of modern biology. Biopolitics ignores the individual citizen, instead regarding life as a process operating between individuals or at the impersonal level of populations. Unlike the sovereign politics it replaced, biopolitics eschews waging direct violence against its subjects, for it creates national success by improving health, and not by directly threatening subjects with death. Of course, it turns out to be terribly lethal as well. With its distinctive focus on biomedical threats, new zombie media continue this biopolitical conflation of health and politics. Although influenced by 21st century medicine, the genre reflects many aspects of older biopolitical paradigms. It conflates illness with political disorder, reduces persons to the bodily dysfunction from which they suffer, and imagines the unhealthy as dangerous masses. In its simplest form, new zombie media follow this tradition with images of pervasive zombie crowds. Within the mass, the individual zombie and all traces of the person it was vanish into lurching or rushing waves of infection. These images assume our participation in a paradigm that imagines politics as the improvement of biological life, life understood not as an individual phenomenon, but in terms of masses differentiated by criteria of health and sickness. Despite this rich conceptual framework, much recent zombie scholarship takes its cue not from Foucault, but from Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, who argues that biopolitics began when Greek political thought divided life into two categories: zo, the natural or bare life shared by all creatures, including humans, and bios, the political life exclusive to humanity. By conceptually dividing the two, Western political theory constituted politics in terms of an exclusion, the exclusion of bare life from the legal and social structures governing bios. This, quote, inclusive exclusion, which politicizes bare life, inaugurates a practice of sanctioned extra-legal violence against those people classified as lacking political existence. Because they fall outside the sphere of law, these bare lives, like animal lives, may be killed without being murdered. Scholarship informed by Agamben's work illuminates the nearly ubiquitous acceptance in new zombie media of extra-legal violence against the monster. Like the many people who lack citizenship or who we imagine to be incapable of political participation, the zombie is de facto excluded from legal protections. It may be killed individually or in mass, cold relentlessly, but never murdered. And yet, applying Agamben's broad distinction between bare and political life to the genre may occlude health's defining role in new zombie media. Our acceptance of violence against zombies originates from their status as imagined non-persons, and from the aggressive threat they represent to medically informed notions of health. The virtually universal depiction of violence waged against humans by zombies becomes legible to a biopolitics that, by equating health and political order, equates the unhealthy other with destruction. In other words, to fully decipher the genre's new biopolitical shift, one also requires Foucault's emphasis on health and populations, but refracted through 21st century biomedical concerns. Zombies threaten with contagious violence because, as in Foucault's analysis, modern politics conceives of life as an unstable force operating through populations. In this context, disability and disease occur not merely to individuals, but threaten to enervate the population and thus life itself. It follows that zombie media represent the ill or impaired as personifications of their conditions, rather than persons with medical problems, for they signify nothing but waste or threat in the political imagination. AMC Network's The Walking Dead makes this troubling biopolitical trope its singular focus over 11 seasons of television. The show is just, I think, concluding right now. The series probes our fears of biological selfhood, depicting the struggle for political order as a relentless battle with diseased masses. On a scene-by-scene basis, the show parrots many of the sensational visual elements made famous by its cinematic predecessors, eliciting our voyeuristic fascination. It dwells on images of grotesque zombie bodies, depicts gratuitous violence, and imagines a post-apocalyptic landscape. But while the series draws us into these cinematic moments, its serialized form builds a narrative that extends and deepens the political themes at work in films of the zombie renaissance. Set shortly after the zombie apocalypse has destroyed all traces of American government and society, The Walking Dead follows a small group of survivors struggling to form a sustainable and virtuous community. Led by former Sheriff's Deputy Rick Grimes, the small band encounters other groups, precipitating violent conflict or peaceful expansion of their community. Beyond moving the show's lumbering plot forward, these clashes reveal alternative political possibilities, exposing Rick's community to the best and worst of humanity. The series reflects, if not profoundly, then consistently, on the uses and abuses of violence, the limits of inclusion, and the tension between survival and idealism. This focus on conflicts within and between human communities has led some to interpret the show Zombies as a mere backdrop, the natural disaster out of which the political drama unfolds. But of the numerous threats to political order, the zombies are the ubiquitous existential challenge to all forms of society. In addition to instigating the fall of American civilization and its resulting chaos, the monsters represent the persistent threat of a world devoid of political order. Crucially, the zombie scourge does not imperil humanity with extinction. Far worse, The Walking Dead seems to suggest, is a reality dominated by damaged life and one silenced by total death. In contrast to its vibrant human characters, the series Zombies lack personal narratives, inner lives, and social intercourse, but this privation is integral rather than peripheral to the show's political themes. Adjacent to its dramas of social formation lurks a life without politics, a kind of anti-political police, threatening to transform healthy humans into its newest citizens. The zombies, the series' most politically meaningful figures, indicate what life must possess to become political, or what deprives it of political order when lost. As in many works of new zombie media, a biomedical explanation differentiates the series zombies from the human community. In a telling departure from Kirkman's graphic novels, the televisual adaptation brings Rick's group to the CDC in the final episode of season 1, where the one remaining scientist shares what little he knows about the plague. In a scene that functions as a brief lesson in neurobiology, Dr. Edwin Jenner projects the recording of a virtual MRI to illustrate synapses firing in the brain of an infected test subject. He explains to the puzzled group that, quote, somewhere in all that organic wiring, all those ripples of light, is you, the thing that makes you unique and human, close quote. Soon the projection shows the infected brain going dark as the pathogen, which he describes as invading the brain like meningitis, kills the subject. But this death gives birth to a new life, where the recording soon registers synapses firing again as the zombie awakens. Lacking an operative frontal cortex and driven by a mindless instinct, this damaged brain will, as Jenner forcefully observes, never resurrect its human part. The show's representation of medical authority and imaging technology to demonstrate the pathogen's effects removes all doubt about the scourge's physical source. Nothing like this scene with its overt biomedical authority, imagery, and concepts appears elsewhere in the show, but its inclusion shapes our understanding of the entire crisis. Here at the series' beginning, The Walking Dead equates the near total destruction of political order with bodily dysfunction on a cellular level. The scene assumes and reinforces a paradigm of biological selfhood resembling Rose's description of 21st century biomedicine. For this CDC scientist, the brain's organic wiring and nothing more produced the human person. Indeed, when viewed from Jenner's biomedical perspective, the zombie's violence might be seen as a medical problem like many others, one among many forms of antisocial behavior, attributable to some neurological condition. The series employs a host of visual and rhetorical tropes to market zombies as categorically ill. Most basically, The Walking Dead forges this connection by representing its monsters as vectors of infectious disease. And Angel, we can pull the PowerPoint back up now. I've got a few more images from The Walking Dead. Great, we can go to the next image. Great, thank you. Because their drive to bite, let's see here. Most basically, The Walking Dead forges this connection by representing its monsters as vectors of infectious disease. Because their drive to bite and consume healthy flesh functions as the vehicle for contamination, shots of walkers, as they are called throughout the series, frequently focus on their teeth, which are bare due to decay of lips and gums, as you can see in the image there. By emphasizing characteristics identified with spreading pathogens, The Walking Dead zombies, much like those of World War Z, personify infection more than they represent ill person. And while the show identifies its monsters visually and titularly with death, seeming to grant them a supernatural element, their liminal status reflects the ambiguous vitality of many pathogens. When asked by Rick if the walkers are alive, Dr. Jenner responds with a question indicative of scientific indecision over the biological status of viruses. Just says, "You tell me." As Cheryl Bint observes, like viruses, the walkers are at once supremely active, driven ceaselessly to transform new hosts into copies of themselves, but also lack the dynamism and awareness we associate with life. The series deepens its thematic focus on health by telling narratives of illness that reflect anxieties surrounding 21st century biomedicine. A far more gradual process than in 28 Days, in The Walking Dead, infection resembles the course of a terminal illness. Unless a bitten limb is quickly amputated, the pathogen gradually infiltrates the body, producing traditional symptoms of viral infection, including fever, weakness, and sweating. After a few days, the infected person dies, soon rising as a zombie. The show's infection scenes can be lengthy, creating dramatic moments resembling end-of-life scenes from any contemporary hospital drama. These moments encode the transition from human to zombie as one of health to disease. For Stephen Shaviro, the series' fixation on these death scenes, and particularly on the anguished decisions of friends and family to terminate the life of the infected, reflect a culture preoccupied with end-of-life care issues. In a period in which biomedicine can preserve life after personhood has departed, The Walking Dead helps viewers explore the thorny moral decision to end a loved one's life. It can do this, Shaviro observes, because in a significant departure from the graphic novel, the series imagines all humans to be pre-symptomatically infected with the pathogen. Like the various diseases and disabling conditions we anticipate developing at some point in our lives, the zombie plague seems coextensive with the body, as much a part of its structure as any other. Echoing our increasing acceptance of molecular and biomedical understandings of self, the show presents a world in which we are all, as Nicholas Rose suggests, asymptomatically or pre-symptomatically ill. Beyond linking zombies to contemporary biomedical concerns, the series forges general negative associations with unhealthy life through its grotesque realization of the monsters. You can go to the next slide. Virtually all pale, emaciated, and with mere wisps of ragged hair, the walkers resemble patients in the final stages of lengthy terminal illnesses. Many walkers bear graphic wounds revealing internal organs in states of grotesque decomposition. Combining imagery of restlessness and disorder, The Walking Dead zombies concretize old and new senses of disease. Originally meaning a lack of ease, disease named a disruption to natural order and the destructive disorder or tension it produces. The walkers' endless wandering, eating, and grasping imply a similar unease or imbalance. Similarly, by visualizing zombies as mere collections of decaying and malfunctioning parts, The Walking Dead emphasizes the natural order they have lost. In numerous scenes, Rick's band easily smashes walkers into puddles of gore, revealing some inherent frailty or rottenness. Although the series represents its monsters as fundamentally enervated, this weakness inspires terror, for it threatens to propagate disorder and weakness throughout the body politic. We hardly require Dr. Jenner's scientific presentation to conclude that walkers are cognitively impaired. Not a single walker displays signs of personal or social sentiment. Irreparably brain damaged, the walkers never learn, use tools, or strategize. In many episodes, they walk insipidly into danger and destruction. The series augments an impression of mental illness or mental disability by attiring its monsters in ragged and dirty clothing. Employing and emphasizing one of the genre's most tired tropes, The Walking Dead fills the screen with dragging feet and lurching steps. This caricature of motor disability becomes an indelible mark differentiating walkers from their human prey. Analyzing the show's obsession with dysfunctional bodies, Anna Mae Duane observes that its walkers are, quote, manifestations of disease and disability run amok, close quote. As such, the series imagines a chasm separating the healthy from the unhealthy. According to Duane, quote, The Walking Dead, like other zombie narratives, repeatedly assures us that it's foolish to imagine any sort of continuum between physical health and repulsive decay. You are on one side of the equation or the other, close quote. This binary shapes The Walking Dead's political universe, building a series that equates a properly ordered body politic with bodily health. A few pivotal moments in the plot expose this underlying biopolitical ethos. Huddled in an abandoned barn in season 5, Rick Grimes looks at his traumatized, hungry band and expresses a disturbing philosophy. Quote, "This is how we survive. We tell ourselves that we are the walking dead." Close quote. Rick's pronouncement elevates survival to his guiding ideal, while hinting at the violence necessary to maintain it. Like the unsympathetic walkers, the group must live without moral commitments in order to kill and thus to live. Although Rick speaks of the walkers figuratively, the scene quickly reminds us that walkers are not simply grotesque expressions of our moral failings. Before the night is over, walkers attack the barn, forcing the group collectively to hold the door closed. In this moment, the community struggle to maintain a literal partition between themselves and the walkers, emphasizes the essential distinction between them. Ragged and violent, Rick's band may resemble zombies, but their collective resistance reveals, if nothing else, the capacity the walkers will never possess. The group can learn to improve individually and communally. This fact is borne out when a stranger appears the next morning, offering to guide them to Alexandria, the show's epitome of a civilized town. Eventually integrating with this community, Rick's band regains its moral compass and inaugurates a new political order that transforms the known human world. Indeed, in its numerous personal and group narratives of violence and redemption, The Walking Dead imagines virtually every person as capable of moral reintegration with the community. Walkers, on the other hand, will never heal, never reintegrate with society, and thus threaten political order per se. What differentiates the damage and disorder of one from the other is purely biological. Inasmuch as political order rests on securing and supporting healthy bodies, The Walking Dead treats the division between these bodies and the walkers as entirely literal and necessary. The barn door holding back the walkers is one of many physical partitions needed to separate the healthy from the unhealthy throughout the series. Alexandria's advantage over many other settlements consists, among other things, in its substantial steel wall. You can see that here in this image. The groups within walled villages may be more or less accepting of each other, but without the walls, health and any hope of civilization rapidly disintegrate. As in many cinematic examples, the need for physical barriers in The Walking Dead results from the zombies' persistent, violent threat of disease and chaos. Not merely figures of bare life, walkers appear as destructive infections because they reflect the threat of unhealthy populations in a modern biopolitical framework. Along similar lines, and reflecting the biopolitical segmenting of life into populations, The Walking Dead envisions walkers as impersonal masses, even as it fixates on the personal narratives and struggles of its characters. Rarely does the camera focus on individual walkers, other than to emphasize their status as dysfunctional, contagious, and violent. As the series develops, long shots of moving masses become a common visual trope, one that subsumes walkers into populations defined by their danger to healthy life. Designated as hordes, these lurching streams of bodies pose a constant danger to settlements and must be lured away lest they breach the walls and infect the healthy population within. Over the course of many seasons, imagery of fortresses and diseased masses lose the sense of emergent novelty they might have conveyed in a feature-length film. By weaving these tropes into the fabric of its fictional reality, The Walking Dead normalizes the impersonal division of healthy from unhealthy, representing the extreme measures of pandemic biopolitics as the stuff of everyday life. The same normalcy pervades the series' constant depiction of graphic violence waged against walkers. The Walking Dead's unequivocal extermination of walkers indicates their status as life without political value. Not as passive as Agamben's bare life, but similarly positioned. Walkers can be killed in the series, but they are never murdered. The show assumes our acceptance of this unspoken rule, where it depicts the unhesitant killing of thousands of walkers while preaching the spiritual and social dangers of unchecked violence. Throughout the series, Morgan, a prominent character, undergoes a moral awakening, transforming him from merciless killer to peaceful guru. Carrying only a wooden staff to defend himself, Morgan abhors violence against the healthy, but dispatches walkers without a second thought. Forced to engage in lethal violence to help save the community from the saviors, who are a sadistic group of humans. By season 8, Morgan is a traumatized and confused figure. To assuage his guilt, a friend recommends that he return to his peaceful ways and use the sharp end of his stick on the dead and the round, non-lethal end on the living. In this and numerous examples, The Walking Dead explores how violence destroys personal lives and political order, while depicting violence against the dead as a necessary means for protecting both. Throughout the show, the uninitiated are instructed in specialized techniques for killing zombies, much as they are trained to perform basic life skills. Basically, it's a kind of militarized existence. What designates zombies as lives that may be killed in The Walking Dead, as life without political value, are their damaged bodies and brains. But the opposite point holds as well. The series designates a life as politically valuable, as warranting legal protection, when it consists of a supremely able body. And I should just say, as an aside, this is something we could potentially talk about a bit in the Q&A. I didn't really have time to discuss the inherent ableism that is also a significant part of zombie media. By interpreting the zombie renaissance as a reflection of our darkest biopolitical fantasies, I mean not to infer a link between contemporary medical practice and the genre's violent approach to disease and disability. My purpose is neither paranoiacally to imagine some insidious new eugenics, nor to blame biomedicine for assumptions it never intended to support. Many healthcare workers labor diligently to know and treat their patients as persons. To these doctors and nurses, the patient is a complex self, a narrative, a history, but never a socially destructive disease. And yet the contrast between our medical practice and our medicalized fictions should not lead us to dismiss the latter as meaningless entertainment. At the same time that television and film illustrate a strengthening conflation of disease and destruction, we increasingly accept a new paradigm of biomedicine, one that embroils the self in the body's vulnerable molecular structures. With what renders us legal and social persons so dependent in our imaginations on bodily function, how indeed could the stakes of health or its absence be greater? The dramatic shift from Romero's zombies to our pervasive millennial monster hinges on many historical factors, but it indicates overwhelmingly the influence of biomedicine and health on our sense of political order. It is difficult to imagine how this seismic shift in the leading horror genre does not suggest or pretend medical, economic, and political changes in our approach to those we label as healthy or unhealthy. For despite the best intentions of physicians, a society that maps the line between social order and chaos onto that between healthy and unhealthy populations will exist in a fraught relationship with both. Excluding the sick that it also attempts to heal, it fails to understand that, quote, healthy bodies inhabit a vital continuum with the, quote, unhealthy, rendering the binary suspect. But the zombie renaissance makes policing this division one of its primary, perhaps unconscious goals becomes most apparent in The Walking Dead's defining political moment. Having just defeated the saviors, the group brutally enslaving their communities, Rick stands before his citizenry on a hilltop overlooking a huge horde of walkers. He inaugurates a new age of political growth by condemning the saviors' false notion of community, but most importantly, by equating the future with healthy bodies. Quote, "We are life, that is death, and it's coming for us, unless we stand together. So go home, then the work begins, the new world begins," close quote. Thank you.